We were just roommates. Quiet mornings, separate lives, until a single glance changed everything. It wasn't planned. It wasn't spoken. But in the silence, we found something neither of us could ignore. The first night Miles Whitaker moved into the apartment, he didn't unpack much. He placed a single suitcase by the door, left his laptop bag on the kitchen table, and stood in the center of the unfamiliar space, letting the quiet wrap around him like a second skin. After the chaos of the past few months, quitting his job, leaving behind a city that felt like a weight, and saying goodbye to a version of himself he no longer recognized, this silence felt like something close to safety. Rowan Ellis, already living there for over a year, said little beyond offering a spare key and showing where the clean towels were. There was no awkward tour, no forced small talk, just an almost invisible nod of understanding that Miles needed time. Rowan, it turned out, was someone who didn't fill silence unnecessarily. And for that, Miles was grateful. They became roommates by chance, not choice. A mutual acquaintance connected them, one needing space, the other needing to get away. It wasn't meant to be permanent. A few weeks, maybe a month. But time moved strangely in that apartment. Like the clock ticked just a little slower, the days bled into one another with the ease of a half-forgotten dream. Mornings were quiet rituals. Miles drank black coffee in the same mug every day, standing by the window. Rowan cooked eggs and toast with headphones in, always humming something soft and low. They rarely spoke during those early hours, but there was no tension. Just a rhythm forming between two people who didn't know each other well, but moved around each other like they might one day. Miles noticed things he hadn't expected to. The way Rowan tilted his head when he read, like he was trying to hear the words. The way he smiled, barely there, but warm, when the evening light fell through the kitchen blinds. How his laughter, rare as it was, felt like a reward rather than a reaction. He noticed how Rowan always made a second cup of tea, even if Miles never asked for one. It was never spoken, but there was something in the air between them, something slow and quiet and careful. Not romantic, not yet. More like recognition. The kind of familiarity that creeps in slowly, layer by layer, until it's part of the walls. One evening, it rained so hard the city outside disappeared behind a veil of water. Miles stood by the window, watching headlights smear across the glass like streaks of paint. Behind him, Rowan sat on the couch, a book open on his lap but unread. The room was dim, lit only by the kitchen light and the silver-blue flicker of a muted television screen. Neither of them spoke. The rain did all the talking, tapping against the windows, steady and constant. Miles turned from the glass and looked at Rowan, who was staring at the same page for what must have been 10 minutes. Their eyes met briefly, unintentionally, and neither of them looked away right away. It was only a second, maybe two, but something in that shared glance made the room feel warmer, closer. Miles looked away first, heart thudding louder than it should have been. He didn't know what to make of it. He didn't want to make anything of it, but stayed with him. Later that night, long after Rowan had gone to bed and the rain had softened into mist, Miles lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't used to sharing space, not like this. Not where silence could feel like a conversation and glances could linger a little too long. He thought about Rowan's bare feet on the hardwood floor, the way he always left the light on in the hallway, how he never knocked, but never intruded. Miles thought about how, for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he needed to explain himself to anyone. Something was shifting. He couldn't say what it was or where it was going. But it was there, in the way they moved around each other, in the quiet moments that hung between them like suspended breath. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was more like gravity, a pull that didn't ask questions or make demands, just existed. When Miles finally fell asleep, it was with the faint memory of Rowan's eyes lingering in his mind, and the sound of rain still whispering against the window. And for the first time in months, the silence in his chest felt like it was beginning to lift. The days after the rain felt different, though nothing visible had changed. The same routines played out. Quiet mornings, separate workspaces, muted conversations that barely scratched the surface. But underneath the calm, something unspoken stirred, like dust catching light in an otherwise empty room, it was only visible if you stopped and really looked. Miles noticed it first in the way Rowan stood a little closer than before. Not close enough to draw attention, but close enough that Miles could feel the warmth radiating off him in the kitchen when they reached for the same cabinet. There were other things, too. The way Rowan's gaze lingered a half-second longer across the breakfast table. The subtle shifts in expression when their eyes met, like Rowan was silently wondering the same thing Miles didn't dare ask. One evening, they both reached for the remote at the same time, fingers brushing. A small thing, but Miles felt it like a current. He froze for a moment, long enough to notice that Rowan didn't pull away right away. Their hands remained close, not touching anymore, but not quite apart either. It became a pattern, these quiet moments of almost. Rowan offering him tea without asking. Miles choosing to sit on the couch when he could have retreated to his room. Books left open on coffee tables, half-read and quietly shared. They began to exist not just as roommates, but as something softer, something undefined. One night, Rowan fell asleep on the couch. Miles found him like that, book pressed to his chest, one arm draped behind the cushions, head tilted slightly back. He looked peaceful in a way that made Miles pause. It felt wrong to wake him, but also wrong to leave. So Miles sat on the armchair across from him, the room dim and quiet except for the hum of the city outside. He watched Rowan's chest rise and fall, steady, slow. There was a tenderness in the stillness. Miles didn't know why he felt it so deeply, this ache, this want to stay close, to keep watching, as if something sacred might break if he looked away. Eventually, Rowan stirred. His eyes blinked open, soft and unfocused. He didn't seem surprised to find Miles there. If anything, there was something like relief in his expression, a calm understanding that didn't need explanation. Neither of them spoke. Miles nodded once, small and barely visible, and Rowan mirrored the motion. Then, without a word, Rowan stood and padded down the hall to his room. The silence that followed felt louder than before. That night, Miles couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every breath feeling heavier than the last. It wasn't confusion that kept him awake. It was clarity, the kind that arrived slowly, without fanfare, but once present, refused to leave. There was something between them. It wasn't friendship, at least not the kind he'd known. It wasn't longing in the romantic sense either. Nothing about it felt like the stories he'd read or the movies he'd seen. It was quieter, more rooted, a sense of knowing, of recognition, of home. He thought about Rowan's hands, how steady they were when he cooked, how careful when he turned pages, how still they were when their fingers brushed. He thought about the way Rowan existed in a space, never demanding it, but never shrinking from it either. There was something grounding in his presence, something that made Miles feel less lost without trying. The next morning, nothing was said. They both moved through the kitchen like usual, the lights soft, the air still. But Miles noticed that Rowan left his mug on the table when he left, something he never did. And when Miles picked it up to wash it, his fingers lingered on the ceramic, like holding something important. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't even certainty. But it was there, undeniable and growing. Not in grand gestures or declarations, but in the quiet things. A glance, a pause, a touch that never needed to be explained. And as the days passed, Miles began to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. There was a quiet Saturday that felt different from the others, though the day itself offered no real reason. The sun filtered gently through the windows, casting soft shadows along the wooden floors. Miles sat at the table with a half-empty cup of coffee, his thoughts elsewhere. Rowan was nearby, seated on the couch with his legs folded beneath him, reading with a furrowed brow and a pencil between his fingers. The air felt thicker than usual, not heavy with tension, but with awareness. Each glance that passed between them was slightly too long, each silence slightly too full. Neither of them addressed it, but it lived in the room with them, as if it had always been there and they had only now begun to see it clearly. Later, the rain returned. A light, persistent drizzle that painted the windows in slow, wandering trails. The soft tapping became the day's soundtrack. It made the world feel slower, softer, They ended up in the living room, the television on, but ignored, both of them stretched across opposite ends of the couch. The space between them felt narrow in a way it hadn't before. Miles watched the flicker of light dance across Rowan's face, noticing how still he was, how quiet he had always been. There was something about him that calmed the noise in Miles' mind, something that made everything feel less sharp. Time passed without measure. The clock ticked quietly from somewhere down the hall. Then, without any conversation, Rowan shifted, moving just enough that their knees nearly touched. It wasn't deliberate, not exactly, but it wasn't accidental either. Miles didn't move. He couldn't. The closeness made his pulse quicken in a way he hadn't expected. There was no fear in it, just something deeper, a curiosity, a recognition, a sense of standing at the edge of something real. The silence became louder, the kind of silence that felt full of words unspoken. Rowan turned toward him slightly, his book now resting on the cushion beside him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something steady, something unguarded. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden confession, just a quiet unfolding of truth between two people who had been moving toward it for weeks. Rowan's hand rested lightly between them, close enough that Miles could reach out and meet it with his own. And after a breath, he did. Their fingers touched first, just the tips. Then slowly, uncertainly, their hands fit together in the space between them. Neither of them looked away. The contact was gentle, deliberate, and filled with more meaning than any words could have carried. They stayed like that, hands joined, eyes steady, as if the room had paused to give them space. There was no need to speak, no urge to explain what they both already knew. Miles felt his heart race, not from panic, but from the overwhelming realization that he hadn't felt this close to anyone in years. Not physically, but emotionally. Someone seeing him, meeting him where he was. Rowan's thumb moved slightly, brushing against Miles' skin in a gesture so small and careful it nearly broke him. There was no pressure in it, no demand, just a presence. A question, an offering. The rain continued its quiet song against the windows. Inside the room, nothing moved. Nothing shifted, except everything. In that one moment, everything changed. Not with words, not with declarations, but with a shared stillness that said, "I see you. I'm here." Miles exhaled slowly, feeling his entire body soften in response. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know what this meant or what it would become. But he knew this. He didn't want to let go. Not now. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The morning after they first touched hands, the apartment felt almost unchanged, yet everything had shifted. The coffee still brewed at the same hour, the floorboards creaked under the same footsteps, and the usual silence still lingered in the corners. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not avoidance, not uncertainty. Something gentler. A silence filled with meaning. Miles awoke before the sun rose, his body still and his thoughts restless. He stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling while the weight of the previous night settled over him like a soft blanket. There had been no conversation after that moment on the couch, just stillness, hands held until the late hours, and then a quiet nod good night as they went to their rooms. He hadn't slept much, but he hadn't felt uneasy either. If anything, he felt something like relief. A tension that had stretched quietly for weeks had finally eased. There was still uncertainty, still 100 questions he didn't know how to ask, but there was also peace. Something between them had opened, and neither of them had closed it. When he finally emerged from his room, the apartment was quiet as ever. Rowan was in the kitchen, barefoot, his hair slightly disheveled from sleep. He moved slowly, deliberately, as he always did, setting 2 mugs on the counter, pouring hot water, dropping tea bags into the cups. He didn't look up when Miles entered, but he pushed one of the mugs across the surface when he heard the footsteps. No words were spoken. Miles took the mug and sat down at the table while Rowan leaned against the counter. The quiet between them was no longer filled with wondering. It had become a place where breath could settle, where presence was enough. As the morning unfolded, they went about their routines like they always had. But now their movements seemed slightly more in sync. When Miles opened a cabinet, Rowan was already stepping aside. When Rowan walked past, Miles instinctively shifted to give him space. They weren't avoiding each other. They were adjusting, tuning in like instruments, finding harmony. In the afternoon, they cleaned the apartment together. It wasn't planned. One of them picked up a cloth, and the other joined. They moved in rhythm, passing items back and forth, sharing glances and half-smiles. Still no words. None needed. A subtle brush of a shoulder. A passing touch of fingertips. Small gestures that carried weight. That evening, they sat together again, this time without the invisible line between them. Rowan brought a blanket and tossed it across their laps without explanation. Miles didn't react, just let the warmth settle in. The room was dimly lit, the TV casting soft shadows. The same spot, the same quiet. But now, when Rowan leaned slightly to the side, his shoulder resting near Miles, there was no hesitation. Miles allowed his body to relax into it, closing the space completely. No thoughts, no calculations, just comfort. The contact was subtle but grounding, like finding shelter in the middle of a quiet storm. They remained like that for a long time. No movement, no conversation, just a flicker of light from the screen and the occasional sound of rain returning outside. The air between them was steady, undisturbed. Miles felt his heart settle. It didn't pound like it had before. It simply beat, slow and calm. The connection between them had always been there, waiting, but now it breathed freely. It existed without permission, without boundaries. There was no rush to define it, no urgency to label it, just a mutual understanding that something real had taken root. When Rowan eventually stood to turn off the TV, he didn't retreat to his room. Instead, he returned to the couch, not at the opposite end, but close. Not quite touching again, but near enough that the space between them felt intentional. Safe. Miles didn't speak. He only looked at him, eyes heavy but soft. Rowan's gaze met his, and there was something quiet there, something grateful. As if the silence between them was the most honest thing they had ever shared. The rest of the night passed like a deep breath. Slow, steady, uncomplicated. And as Miles went to bed later, the hallway light still glowing dimly like it always had, he felt something inside him shift again. Not like a collapse, like a door opening. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the apartment shifted again, but not in a way anyone else would have noticed. The furniture hadn't moved, the calendar still hung crooked on the wall, the kettle still whistled at the same time each morning. But the space itself felt warmer, lived in, shared. Miles found himself smiling more without realizing it. The tension that used to sit between his shoulders had dissolved into something softer. Rowan no longer felt like a roommate, not even like a possibility. He had become something certain, not because of grand gestures, not because of confessions or declarations, but because of how they existed in each other's space, without apology, without distance. There were no rules, no schedule to their closeness. Some evenings, they sat together in silence, Miles' legs stretched over Rowan's lap, a book open but unread in his hands. Other nights, they would drift into sleep side by side on the couch, the television a low hum in the background, their heads leaning together like branches leaning into the same wind. Touch became a natural language between them, a brush of fingers as they passed in the hallway, a quiet hand resting on a knee during long drives. The weight of Rowan's palm resting lightly on Miles' back when he stood at the sink too long, thinking. Their connection deepened in the absence of need for words. One morning, Miles woke to the smell of something burning. He rushed into the kitchen only to find Rowan staring down at a charred piece of toast, blinking at it like it had betrayed him. Without a word, Miles stepped in, tossed the toast out, and made another. Rowan leaned against the counter, watching him with a sheepish half-smile. It was nothing, and it was everything. That was how things unfolded between them. Not through intensity, but through presence. Not through questions, but through consistency. When Rowan's sister came to visit, Miles found himself instinctively stepping closer, standing beside Rowan as introductions were made. No one explained what their relationship was, and no one asked. It didn't matter. The way they stood near each other, the way their glances anchored them, it said enough. One evening, as they sat on the floor surrounded by unfolded laundry, Miles looked over at Rowan, who was attempting to untangle a sweatshirt sleeve with intense concentration. The light from the lamp cast a soft glow across his face. It hit Miles then, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation. He didn't want to go back to how things were before. Not just before Rowan, but before this calm, before this safety. He didn't need to say it. Rowan looked up at that exact moment, meeting his gaze with a quiet kind of understanding. The corner of his mouth tugged upward slightly, and without thinking, he reached over and rested his hand on Miles' knee. The silence stretched, comfortable and steady. They had never said the words aloud. Not "I love you," not even "I want this." But everything they did said it louder than any phrase ever could. The next morning, Miles stood by the window with his coffee, watching the sun break across the rooftops. Rowan joined him without a word, setting his mug beside his and slipping his hand into Miles' without hesitation. No fanfare, no announcement. Just two people who had found something real in the quiet. There had been no moment of decision, no single turning point. Only the slow accumulation of choosing each other, day by day, glance by glance, silence by silence. They didn't know what the future would look like. Didn't need to. What they had was enough. And in that soft morning light, fingers loosely intertwined, the only thing that mattered was the truth between them. They had chosen this. Together.